At a midnight diner in Boston, 28-year-old waitress Sarah Miller thought the only weight she carried was tips too small and bills too high, until a wealthy stranger walked in and her eyes locked onto the silver necklace Sarah wore. That single glance cracked open a secret buried for 30 years, a lost daughter, a stolen legacy, and a waitress about to be dragged into a billion-dollar war she never asked for. Where are you watching from? Comment your city or country below. What if the most dangerous thing in the room wasn't a person at all, but a glint of silver catching the light like a held breath? The night owl sat on the corner of Tremont and a street that always smelled faintly of rain and buses, even when the sky was clear. Its neon sign stuttered between NIG and AUL, as if the bird were trying to wink its way through a long Boston night. Inside, the diner's air carried layers. Coffee singed a shade too dark, warmed maple syrup, the metallic tang of nickels and dimes that passed through too many hands. Forks chimed against thick ceramic. The red vinyl booths squeaked when someone shifted their weight, a chorus of tiny groans that belonged to every late shift and broken promise in the city. Sarah Miller threaded herself through this music the way a dancer finds a beat in a crowded room. 28. Hair pulled into a practical knot that still let a few strands escape. A plain blue uniform softened by a single stubborn detail. The thin silver chain at her throat. The charm lay flat against her skin, an oval polished smooth by years of worry. She wore it under the collar when the manager prowled. Tonight, the top button hadn't survived the wash, and the necklace peeked out with each pour of coffee. Her hands moved on autopilot. Check the counter. Wipe the sugar rings. Scan booth 3. 2 students in socks caps arguing over a philosophy midterm. Booth 5, a nurse too tired to finish her pie. At the far stool, a trucker in a flannel jacket counted tip money into neat soldiers. Sarah slid the mason jar from under the register. College fund, written in Sharpie, that had ghosted through months of dish steam, and dropped in a folded 5 from her apron pocket. It made a soft, glassy clink, one that always landed in her chest like a small promise. The door chimed. Cold air rolled through, chasing a swish of perfume that didn't belong to the diner's regular language. Heads turned. It wasn't every night a black town car idled at the curb, and a polished driver opened the door for a woman who carried winter like a mood. The newcomer's coat was camel wool that broke the doorway's rectangle into something from a magazine, a slice of money where there should have been formica. She removed leather gloves with precise flourishes and paused, as if listening to the building's heartbeat. Then she took the end stool, didn't quite sit, and looked down the length of the counter with a collector's eye. Sarah brought water automatically, feeling, as she always did with people like this, suddenly much more aware of her shoes, the scuff on the toe, how the floor stuck for half a second at every step. The woman, mid-60s, posture like a sail catching the clean part of the wind, accepted the glass without drinking. Her attention returned to the door, to the night, to whatever world could summon a car with a driver after 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. "Coffee?" Sarah asked, and even that one word carried the diner's steam. A beat, then a nod. Sarah reached for the pot. The necklace lifted when she tipped the carafe, light catching the charm's worn face. The woman's eyes, gray like cut stone, snapped to the motion and didn't let go. The coffee overflowed just enough to snake down the saucer's lip, a thin caramel ribbon that Sarah wiped with practiced shame. The woman's gaze never left the oval at Sarah's throat. Years had taught Sarah to spot trouble before it spoke. a clenched jaw over a steak, a credit card face down for a reason, a party of 5 who would pretend not to know how tipping worked. This was different. The air thinned, like the city had lifted an inch. The woman's gloved hand rose and hovered, almost, but not quite, touching the charm. She seemed to think better of it and pulled back, fingers rigid as if from a flame. "That's a pretty old piece, Toe," said someone 2 stools down, a regular who loved to weigh in on anything. "Antique?" Sarah offered a shrug meant to end conversations. The necklace had been her mother's. No, not had been, was still, always, gifted in a quiet kitchen on a morning that smelled like ginger tea and hospital soap. Her mother's voice, softer then, had made a ceremony out of fastening it. Keep this close. It was the only thing she took when life asked her to travel light. On nights that folded into themselves, Sarah would touch the oval through cloth and imagine the way her mother's thumb used to warm metal with a single absent press. At the far end of the counter, the woman set the gloves side by side, aligned like measured words. Her driver had chosen a booth along the wall, where reflections shattered in the chrome. He watched her the way trained people do, noting exits, noting everything. "Do you need cream?" Sarah asked, because language needs somewhere to go. The woman finally spoke, Boston's old money consonants softened by a worldlier education. "Black, thank you." It should have ended there. Coffee, plate of lemon pie, the small theater of cash on the counter, a silent departure. But the necklace dragged the room's compass. Every move Sarah made slipped the charm into view. The woman's gaze tracked it, went distant, returned as if surfacing from a memory with teeth. Her breathing changed. No drama, just a slightly ragged edge on exhale that no one but a waitress would clock. Booth 5 needed a refill. The students wanted more ketchup. The trucker asked for a to-go lid. Sarah did the diner's dance, and each time she passed the end stool, she felt the chill of being appraised. Not as a person, but as a puzzle piece someone had been missing for a very long time. When she bent to fetch a new roll of quarters from the drawer, the chain slid free to the charm settling perfectly against the hollow of her throat. Light found it again, an obedient, betraying star. Outside, snowflakes the size of thumbnail clippings began to drift. They stuck to the window in little private galaxies. Inside, the heat rattled through vents that had lost their will to aim. Silverware clattered in the bus tub. A dishwasher shouted over the machine and laughed at his own joke. Life insisted on itself in details. The woman didn't touch her coffee. Sarah, who could not afford to spook customers, who could not afford to spook her manager, who could not afford anything that didn't go directly into the jar or the rent or the clinic bills, finally stood her ground at the end stool and asked if everything was okay. Her voice held. The woman looked up, truly up, and the diner fell away. What stared back was grief that had been ironed into habits, then folded neatly and stacked for 30 years. In the oval, the woman saw a wedding day, a boat, a daughter with laughing eyes, a chain fastened in a mirror by hands that trembled with hope. It flickered across her face in a flash too quick for anyone but a hungry storyteller to catch. Her mouth opened, closed. She leaned forward the slightest measure, as if words were heavy and she had to step into them. For a heartbeat, Sarah wondered whether this stranger would ask to buy the necklace. People with that coat sometimes thought anything could be bought. But the woman's expression made that fear silly, small. The neon outside clicked from NIG to OWL and held. The heat coughed. Somewhere, a fork fell and didn't break. The woman's voice arrived finally, not loud, not soft, but carrying an authority that cleared a path through the clatter. "Where did you get that necklace?" Morning never came gently for Sarah Miller. It usually arrived with the shrill crack of her alarm after barely 4 hours of sleep, a muffled cartoon humming from the living room where her daughter, Emily, curled up under a thrift store blanket. The apartment smelled faintly of reheated pasta and detergent that never quite lifted the grease from uniforms. Sunlight slanted through thin blinds, striping the room in gold and gray. Sarah buttoned her diner shirt, still damp in patches from a rushed wash, and tied her sneakers tight enough to keep the soles from flapping. The bills on the counter stayed where they always were. Medical statements from Boston Children's, red ink reminders like silent accusations. Sarah's tips barely stretched to cover rent and groceries, but Emily's asthma medication carved holes through every paycheck. Sarah pressed the inhaler into her daughter's small hand before kissing her goodbye, the plastic cool and necessary. She promised she'd be home before the next cartoon episode ended, a lie spoken with the rhythm of truth. By afternoon, the night owl pulled her back into its orbit. The neon buzzed overhead. The coffee pots hissed and spat like restless snakes. The grind of the job never slowed. Orders barked, plates clattered, and the manager's eyes tracked her every move with suspicion sharpened by years of disappointment. Rude customers tested her patience daily. One banker clicking his pen and complaining the pie wasn't warm enough. A drunk who snapped his fingers for service as though she were furniture. Sarah swallowed replies with the same discipline she used to stretch leftovers into dinner. Her coworkers didn't help. Behind the counter, Marcy smirked, pointing at the silver chain peeking from Sarah's collar. "Still wearing that cheap old trinket? Thought you'd pawn it by now." The laughter from the busboy followed, quick and careless, and heat pricked behind Sarah's ears. She pulled the charm back under her shirt, wishing it didn't feel like shame to protect something sacred. When the rush dipped, she wiped crumbs from a booth where the vinyl split at the seams. Her jar sat on the counter, college fund. Letters fading, but still loud enough to remind her of what she fought for. Each coin dropped in with a clink that sounded smaller than hope, but louder than surrender. She kept her back straight, shoulders steady, even when exhaustion begged her to collapse into the nearest chair. Closing shift stretched past midnight. Outside, Boston's air grew sharp, the streets slick with sleet. Sarah stepped out with her tips bundled in her pocket, the necklace cool against her skin. She lingered a moment, watching her breath fog in front of the flickering sign. The world carried on, indifferent. Yet under the indifference, a whisper formed in her mind. She touched the charm, fingers brushing the smooth oval, and spoke softly into the cold night. "Mom, I won't give up." The words vanished into air, but left their weight inside her chest. The city's noise rose again. Buses groaning, sirens in the distance, the hum of lives colliding. But for Sarah, everything narrowed to that single promise. A vow small enough to be overlooked, yet strong enough to hold her through another day, another shift, another battle she hadn't even seen coming. Snow clung to Boston's brick sidewalks in patches, melting into gray rivers that trickled toward drains. Sarah's boots left damp prints as she climbed the narrow stairwell to her apartment, every muscle begging for rest. Emily was already asleep on the couch, a stuffed rabbit nestled against her chest. Sarah brushed a stray curl from her daughter's forehead, then sat at the kitchen table with a stack of bills and a calculator that refused to deliver mercy. Her fingers traced the chain at her neck. The necklace lay warm from her skin, a small anchor in the storm. She remembered the woman at the diner, the way her gaze had burned into the silver charm like recognition, like loss. The thought unsettled her, but exhaustion blurred the edges until it felt like a half-remembered dream. The next morning, life resumed its ordinary grind. Sarah dropped Emily at school, then headed to class, the fluorescent lights of the community college flickering above rows of tired students. She scribbled notes about anatomy, her mind drifting toward rent due in 4 days, the diner's endless shifts, the sharp laugh of Marcy mocking her necklace. By evening, she was back in her uniform, pouring coffee and dodging spilled ketchup. Yet beneath the clang of dishes, she noticed a shadow lingering at the window. A man in a dark overcoat watched her too intently, a leather notebook in his hand. When she turned, he stepped away into the snow. A chill ran through her, but she forced her smile back on for the customers. 2 days later, the knock came. It was firm, deliberate, nothing like the neighbor kids asking for sugar. Sarah froze, clutching Emily's hand. Through the peephole stood the same man in the overcoat, his hair slicked back, expression unreadable. When she opened the door a crack, he introduced himself in a low, precise voice. "My name is Daniel Hart. I'm an investigator. Margaret Whitmore asked me to speak with you." The name landed heavy. Sarah knew it from newspapers. Chairwoman of Whitmore Holdings, a financial empire that sounded as unreachable as the moon. Sarah's pulse kicked. "I think you've got the wrong person," she said quickly, ready to close the door. But Hart held up a sealed envelope stamped with a golden crest, an ornate W pressed into the paper. "She insisted you receive this, privately." Sarah's hands shook as she accepted it. The paper felt heavier than its size should allow. She tore it open at the kitchen table, Emily peeking over her shoulder. Inside was a single page, a birth certificate. Her eyes scanned the words, the ink blurred in places. There it was, her mother's name, Isabel Russo. The name clawed at Sarah's memory. Her mother had always been careful, never speaking much about the past, never keeping more than a shoebox of letters written in a looping script softened by water stains. Now the letters sharpened into focus. Isabel Russo, the same name whispered in old society columns Sarah once read in discarded magazines at the diner. The daughter of Margaret Whitmore, lost at sea 30 years ago. Her breath came short. Confusion crowded out reason. A scam, surely. Some twisted attempt to pull her into a story that wasn't hers. She pressed the paper flat, as if smoothing it could erase the implication. Emily tugged her sleeve. "Mom, what does it mean?" Sarah forced a smile, though her hands trembled against the wood. "It means someone made a mistake, honey." But her eyes betrayed doubt. The seal gleamed under the dim kitchen bulb, undeniable. A truth long buried was clawing its way up, demanding to be seen. Another knock startled her, Hart still waiting at the threshold. His voice carried steady patience. "There's more you need to know." Sarah closed her eyes, the necklace pressing like a weight against her collarbone. For the first time, she felt the ground beneath her tilt. The world she thought she knew was cracking open. One document, one seal, one question at a time. And nothing about her life would stay ordinary again. The envelope sat like a trespasser on Sarah's kitchen table. The edges curled where her hands had gripped it too tightly. Her fingerprints smudged across the gold Whitmore seal. Emily had drifted back to sleep on the couch, her rabbit tucked under one arm. But Sarah couldn't close her own eyes. Not with that document staring back at her. The birth certificate wasn't alone. Tucked behind it was a folded photocopy. Her mother's driver's license, yellowed at the corners, the name Isabel Russo, printed clear as daylight. The neat lettering looked so strange beside the faded grocery lists and love notes Sarah had once found in her mother's shoebox of keepsakes. It was undeniable. The names matched. Daniel Hart, the investigator, leaned against the counter, hands clasped behind his back as though he were in a courtroom. His tone was careful, deliberate. Margaret Whitmore wanted you to see this privately. She didn't want to force you into a storm before you had the chance to breathe. Sarah bristled. Storm? This already feels like one. He inclined his head. You deserve to know the truth before it goes public. 30 years ago, the Whitmores lost a daughter in a boating accident. That daughter, Isabel, was your mother. The words cracked something inside her. Sarah remembered her mother's tired smile, the way she'd worked 3 jobs, the whispered prayers she thought no one heard. Could that woman, the one who clipped coupons and pressed hand-me-down sweaters, really have been part of a dynasty of marble mansions and investment portfolios? It felt absurd. Hart slid another item across the table, a small envelope of photographs. Sarah pulled one free. Her mother, younger, hair tumbling in dark waves, holding an infant wrapped in a faded hospital blanket. The edges of the Polaroid were blurred, but the eyes of the baby, her own eyes, stared back at her. Sarah's chest tightened. She wanted to reject it, to fling the photographs into the trash, but the truth hummed under her skin like an electrical current. Still, doubt gnawed at her. Scams came in all shapes. She'd seen them at the diner. Slick-talking men promising lottery winnings if you just handed over your social security number. Why would she believe this? Why now? Hart must have read her silence. You're right to be cautious. But Margaret isn't after your money. She has more than enough. She only wants to meet you before the world knows anything. She asked me to tell you that directly. Sarah swallowed hard. In her memory, her mother's voice rose up, the words she'd repeated when bills piled high and the car broke down on I-93. Wealth doesn't define your worth. Kindness does. She gripped the necklace at her throat, the oval pressing deep into her palm. Everything she had built, every late-night shift, every class scribbled between exhaustion and responsibility, had been hers alone. Would stepping into this new truth mean losing that? The apartment buzzed with the hum of the old radiator. Outside, a siren wailed and faded. Sarah drew in a long breath, the air sharp in her lungs. Finally, she looked Hart squarely in the eye. Tell Margaret. I'll meet her. The decision settled on her shoulders with both weight and relief. From the couch, Emily stirred, whispering in her sleep. Sarah tucked the documents back into the envelope, heart racing. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, only that she was walking toward it, necklace in place, ready to face the storm head-on. The Whitmore estate rose from the outskirts of Boston like a palace that had forgotten the country it belonged to. The wrought iron gates swung open after Hart's brief word into a speaker, and Sarah's borrowed cab rolled up a driveway longer than her entire street. The wheels whispered over stone, past rows of trimmed hedges shaped into perfect domes, past a fountain where bronze horses reared in frozen defiance. Inside the mansion, marble stretched in every direction. The floors reflected chandeliers dripping crystal like icicles. Oil paintings watched from gilded frames. Men in waistcoats, women draped in pearls, each name etched in brass beneath. Whitmore, Whitmore, Whitmore. Sarah felt the soles of her sneakers squeak against polished stone, every sound declaring her as an intruder. Margaret Whitmore descended the staircase, her camel-colored elegance unchanged. Yet in her eyes lingered something raw, longing that cracked through her wealth's polish. She greeted Sarah softly, as if afraid the girl might vanish if startled. "This way," Margaret said, leading her into a drawing room lined with books older than Sarah's apartment building. Waiting inside were others, men in tailored suits, women with diamonds sharp as ice. At the far end sat Richard Whitmore, Margaret's brother-in-law, his tie knotted like a threat. He studied Sarah with the satisfaction of someone expecting to be entertained by failure. A nurse in a white coat entered with a small case. "For clarity," Margaret explained gently, "a DNA test. Just enough to tell us if what we suspect is true." Sarah sat, throat dry. The swab brushed her cheek. She thought of Emily waiting at home with a babysitter, of overdue bills on her kitchen counter. The room smelled faintly of polish and old smoke. She wished desperately for the scent of diner coffee. Hours later, in a sterile corner of a Boston hospital, the results flickered across a monitor. Partial match. Not full proof, but enough to rattle the air. Margaret's hand trembled on the armrest. Sarah's heart slammed, uncertain whether to soar or shatter. Richard struck like a whip. "Partial isn't proof. You see? She's an opportunist, a gold digger playing dress-up with a fake necklace." His voice curled with disdain. "You disgrace us by letting her stand here." The council of relatives murmured, eyes sharp with judgment. They saw not a waitress, not a single mother, not someone who had scraped survival from coffee tips, but a threat to their fortune. Sarah's cheeks burned. She wanted to speak, to shout that she didn't care for their inheritance, but her throat locked. Margaret rose instead, spine straight as a blade. "She deserves respect." Richard leaned forward, hissed across the room so only she and Sarah could hear. "You never should have shown your face here." The words cut deeper than she expected. Sarah gripped the necklace at her throat, the oval warm from her skin. Her mother's ghost pressed into the metal. The mansion's grandeur no longer impressed her. It loomed suffocating, a cathedral built on secrets. And now she stood at its altar, a trespasser whose very presence had ignited a war. She turned toward Margaret, meeting her eyes. The kindness there steadied her, but Richard's sneer promised this was only the beginning. Boston's winter sky sagged low and gray as Sarah hurried from one late shift to the next. But this time the exhaustion wasn't from spilled coffee and rude customers. It was from the storm Richard Whitmore had unleashed. The first blow came with headlines. "Waitress claims to be heiress." Her picture, snapped by some lurking photographer, was plastered on tabloids by the corner store. Co-workers snickered, shoving copies under her nose. "Hey, Princess Sarah, need help counting your tips?" Marcy laughed. The jar labeled college fund now felt like a cruel joke to them. The second blow came in a neat envelope slipped under her apartment door. At first, Sarah thought it was another medical bill. Instead, the letter snarled in cold type. "Walk away while you can." No signature, but the watermark was from a prestigious law firm, Richards. Her hand trembled as she read it again. Emily looked up from coloring at the table. "Mom, why's your face white?" Sarah folded the page quickly, forced a smile she didn't feel. Richard was methodical. He had hired attorneys whose smiles never reached their eyes. They whispered into cameras, painting Sarah as a fraud, a schemer chasing fortune. They dredged up her mother's unpaid hospital bills, her own overdue rent, every sign of poverty weaponized as proof she was desperate. At the diner, customers stopped seeing her as invisible. Now they stared, whispering. A man in a suit muttered to his companion, "She thinks she belongs with them. Ridiculous." Sarah clenched her jaw and kept pouring coffee. Reporters camped outside her building, their questions sharp and shameless. "Did you fake the necklace? How much are you after?" One nearly tripped Emily on the school steps with a microphone. Sarah's stomach knotted until she felt sick. But what haunted her most wasn't the voices outside. It was the truth clawing inside. Each night, she held the birth certificate and photographs under the dim lamp, trying to convince herself she wasn't dreaming. Could she really be the daughter of a family whose empire stretched from Manhattan boardrooms to European banks? Or was she a pawn in someone else's game? One evening, after locking the diner's back door, Sarah unfolded the threatening letter again. The words blurred, but she whispered into the cold alley air, "He's afraid of the truth." Her voice broke, but the defiance inside it steadied her spine. When she stepped out to the street, a dark sedan idled at the curb. The window lowered just enough for a man's eyes to gleam. Then it pulled away, tires hissing against wet pavement. The test wasn't just legal, it was personal, a war against her very identity. Richard wanted her gone, erased like the accident 30 years ago. Sarah clutched the necklace until the oval dug into her palm. Somewhere inside her, fear bent but didn't break. She had endured endless shifts, mockery, and hunger. This was another shift, longer, crueler, but she would not clock out early. The courthouse smelled of varnished wood and damp winter coats. Reporters crowded the steps outside, cameras clicking like locusts as Sarah pushed through with her head lowered. Emily stayed home with a neighbor. Sarah refused to let her daughter see this circus. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everyone in harsh white. Margaret stood by her side, posture regal despite the whispers slicing through the gallery. Her presence was a shield, but Sarah still felt like a waitress trespassing on a marble stage. Richard Whitmore entered with the swagger of a man who believed the building already belonged to him. His lawyers followed, sleek and polished, carrying folders that could ruin a life. He paused just long enough to sneer at Sarah before sliding into his seat. When the judge called the session to order, the air seemed to thin. Margaret rose first, her voice steady but edged with steel. "Richard, enough games. You staged that boating accident 30 years ago. My daughter didn't drown. She lived. She raised Sarah in hiding, away from your greed." Richard's laughter was low, dangerous. "This fortune belongs to me," he said, every syllable dripping contempt. "Blood means nothing. Money and power, that's all that matters. And she," he jabbed a finger at Sarah, "she wants both." The words made Sarah's stomach twist, but something inside her refused to stay silent. She stood, palms damp against the wooden table. "I don't want your money. I never asked for your fortune. I just want the truth about my mother." Her voice cracked but carried, echoing against the paneled walls. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The reporters scribbled faster. The judge lifted an eyebrow. Margaret's hand brushed Sarah's arm. A silent gesture of pride. But Richard wasn't done. He leaned forward, eyes glinting like knives. "The truth? You wouldn't recognize it if it strangled you. You're a fraud, a waitress who got lucky with a trinket. Nothing more." The trial churned into chaos. Lawyers battled with motions, papers slapped against tables. The media outside turned every sentence into headlines. Talk shows debated whether Sarah Miller was a gold digger or a long-lost heir. At the diner, customers craned their necks at her, whispering theories like she couldn't hear. The escalation came swift and brutal. Richard's attorney unveiled forged documents, bank records, letters, even photographs, claiming Isabel Russo had no connection to the Whitmores. They painted Sarah's mother as a runaway who concocted a fairy tale, and Sarah as the daughter trying to cash in. Sarah's chest tightened. She wanted to shout, to tear the lies apart with her bare hands. But the judge studied the forgeries, nodding slowly. The gavel struck once for silence. From her seat, Sarah caught Richard's satisfied smirk. The evidence, false though it was, looked convincing, and the judge's expression leaned toward doubt. For the first time, fear hollowed her. This wasn't just about her identity. It was about losing her mother all over again, buried under Richard's lies. The necklace at her throat felt heavier than iron. She touched it with trembling fingers and whispered in her mind, "Hold me steady, Mom." The trial had become more than a legal fight. It was a clash of values, wealth against truth, greed against love. And for a terrifying moment, it looked like greed was winning. Snow still clung to the church's stone steps, its Gothic spire reaching into a pewter sky. Daniel Hart, the investigator, moved quickly through the side door, breath clouding in the cold. He had followed a thread of whispers, rumors of Isabel Russo hiding here decades ago. Now, with the trial tilting against Sarah, he was desperate for something solid. Inside, the sanctuary smelled of incense and thyme. The caretaker, an old priest with hands marked by years of prayer, led Hart into a back room lined with dusty file cabinets. "She came often," the priest said softly. "A frightened woman with a baby. She left things with us for safekeeping." They pried open a rusted safe behind a wooden panel. The door groaned like it hadn't been touched in years. Inside lay a small bundle wrapped in yellowed cloth. Hart's pulse hammered as he pulled it free. When the courtroom reconvened days later, Richard's lawyers stood tall, certain of victory. They stacked their forged papers high, smirking at Sarah across the aisle. The judge prepared to move forward. But Hart entered like a storm, carrying the bundle. He handed it to Margaret, whose hands trembled as she peeled back the cloth. Gasps rippled through the room. First came a baptism record, ink faded but legible. Sarah Miller, daughter of Isabel Russo. Then Polaroid photos. Isabel, hair loose around her shoulders, cradling a newborn with eyes identical to Sarah's. Finally, a stack of letters written in Isabel's hand, every word steeped in fear and love. The letters described how Richard had orchestrated the boating accident, how she had fled to protect her child. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashed. The judge slammed his gavel for order, but the tide had already turned. Margaret rose, tears streaking her cheeks. She crossed the floor without hesitation, clutching Sarah to her chest. "This is my flesh and blood," she cried, her voice breaking. Years of grief poured out in that single embrace, the weight of decades shattering against truth. Sarah held tight, breath catching. For the first time, she wasn't just the waitress, the outsider. She was a daughter found, a story restored. The necklace at her throat pressed warm between them, as if her mother's spirit had stepped into the room. The judge's voice cut through the silence. "We have new truth before us," he declared, eyes fixed on Richard's pale face. "This evidence changes everything." Richard's smirk vanished. For once, he had no words. The forged papers that had looked so powerful now seemed like ash compared to the raw weight of Isabel's handwriting. Sarah stood straighter, her heart pounding not with fear but with defiance. The lies had cracked, and the light of her mother's truth poured through. The war wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt winnable. The verdict came on a morning bright with frost, sunlight breaking across the courthouse steps like a promise. Reporters swarmed the building, microphones thrust forward as if hungry for blood. But inside, the gavel struck with a finality that silenced every whisper. Richard Whitmore was found guilty. Fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy. His empire of lies collapsed in an instant. The court stripped him of claims, titles, influence. The man who once sneered across mahogany tables now sat hunched, face ashen, his hands bound not by rope, but by the truth that had finally cornered him. Sarah felt her knees weaken. For weeks she had lived on the edge of survival, every headline branding her an imposter, every night filled with doubt. Now the weight lifted, not completely, but enough to let her breathe. Margaret turned to her, eyes brimming. "It's over," she whispered. "You're home now." The words hit harder than the verdict itself. Sarah had never been home anywhere except in the tiny apartment, where she counted tips and tucked Emily under thrift store blankets. But in Margaret's arms, warmth spread through her like sunlight after endless winter. Later, in the quiet outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed again. One shouted the question everyone wanted answered. "What will you do with your massive inheritance?" Sarah blinked at the chaos, flashing bulbs, clamoring voices, but her hand instinctively went to the silver necklace at her throat. She thought of her mother's voice. "Wealth doesn't define your worth. Kindness does." Slowly, she unclasped the chain. The charm rested warm in her palm as she turned to Margaret. "Keep the memory," she said softly, pressing it into her hand. "I'll build a new legacy." Margaret's fingers closed around the necklace, her tears glinting like diamonds in the cold sun. For the first time, Sarah felt something more powerful than exhaustion or fear. She felt choice. She wasn't bound to the diner or the whispers or even the Whitmore fortune. She could shape her life, her daughter's life, into something her mother would have been proud of. That night, she tucked Emily into bed with a promise. Things are going to change, not because of money, but because we finally know who we are. The little girl smiled sleepily, clutching her rabbit. "Then we're strong, right, Mom?" Sarah kissed her forehead. "Stronger than they'll ever know." Outside, Boston hummed with its usual clamor. Sirens, laughter, the steady beat of a city that didn't care for legacies. But inside that small apartment, a new chapter had begun. The storm had broken. Justice had found its mark. And Sarah Miller, once just a waitress, now stood at the edge of something greater than inheritance. She stood at the edge of becoming whole. Spring settled over Boston, softening the city's edges. Trees along Tremont Street bloomed in pale pink, and the night owl's neon sign hummed against warmer nights. Sarah walked past the diner one evening, no longer wearing the uniform that had defined her for years. The smell of burnt coffee and maple syrup still clung to the air, but she was not the exhausted waitress threading between tables anymore. She had returned not as an employee, but as someone reborn. The inheritance had been staggering, numbers too large to fit inside her old calculator, wealth that could have swallowed her whole. But Sarah didn't let it. Most of it was set aside for the Isabel Foundation, named in honor of the mother who had fought through poverty and fear to protect her. The foundation's mission was simple and fierce: support single mothers who struggled as she once had, women balancing night shifts and children's needs against an unforgiving world. Reporters tried to spin it as charity theater, but Sarah didn't care. She knew what it meant to walk out of a pharmacy clutching a child's inhaler, praying the bank account wouldn't collapse under the cost. She knew what it meant to fold a uniform still damp from the wash, to smile at cruel customers because you couldn't afford not to. Every dollar poured into the foundation was a seed planted in soil she had once clawed through herself. In quiet moments, she still carried the echo of her mother's voice. True worth doesn't lie in wealth, but in compassion, wisdom, and the courage to stand tall. Margaret remained close, her grief softened by the gift of a granddaughter she hadn't known she had. Emily thrived under the warmth of 2 generations, laughing more freely now, sketching rabbits and flowers with crayons that no longer had to be scavenged from thrift bins. Yet Sarah refused to let the mansion or the wealth strip her of memory. One evening, she stepped into the diner, the bell over the door jangling like it always had. The booths still squeaked, the coffee still hissed. A few of her old co-workers froze, unsure whether to mock or bow. Sarah only smiled, sliding a bill into the college fund jar that still sat by the register, faded, nearly forgotten. She whispered, "For the next dreamer." When she stepped back into the street, Boston's night wrapped around her, alive with sirens and laughter. She lifted her face to the sky, the weight of years finally easing. The necklace was gone, resting now in Margaret's hands, where it belonged, but its spirit lingered, pulsing in every choice Sarah made. She was no longer just a waitress. She was a mother, a daughter found, a woman who had faced greed and shadows and refused to yield. And to anyone listening, anyone who had ever felt small beneath the weight of the world, she offered her story like a lantern in the dark. If you believe justice and family always find their way back, hit like, comment, and subscribe, so we can share more stories like this together. The night carried her words into the city, a promise stitched with hope.